All right, greetings. Welcome to the Rappaport Center Colloquium. I'm Karen Engel, and I teach at the law school, and along with Neville Hode, co-direct the Bernard and Audrey Rappaport Center for Human Rights and Justice. It is my real pleasure to welcome you to the first lecture of our Fall 2021 Colloquium, entitled Inequality, Labor, and Human Rights, the Future of Work in the Age of Pandemic. Professor Jennifer Bair will present the lecture, Financialization, Fissuring, and the Future of Work, and Professor Jamie Galbraith will respond. Now, some of you may know we host a colloquium at the Rappaport Center every fall on human rights and inequality, which is also part of an interdisciplinary center that we teach at the seminar that we teach in the law school. And this year, I'm teaching that seminar with the Rappaport Center's new postdoctoral fellow, Nina Ebner, who you just heard from. And she just joined us after completing her PhD in geography at the University of British Columbia. And 12 of the people in the audience are in that seminar. So this year's colloquium also offers a follow-up to a pop-up institute we held this past summer, and I have the poster behind me, entitled Beyond the Future of Work, New Paradigms for Addressing Global Inequality. Both Jennifer Bair and Jamie Galbraith participated in that pop-up. So this event today will provide us with a terrific opportunity to continue some of our discussion around rethinking the future of work. And our aim was to do that in part by shifting the discourse away from automation and technology, as well as wage work, and toward very complex historical, productive, extractive, and distributive processes that enable the world's great disparities in power, wealth, and status, to which the conceptions of the future of work and livelihood are so central. Now, that's not a small task to shift the discourse in that way or those ways. But much of Jen Bair's work, especially her work on global value chains, has been key to much of our thinking on this and other projects. So before I introduce her and Jamie Galbraith, just a couple of logistical points. So we have set this up as a meeting, not a webinar, so that we can see each other and engage in conversation along the way. You can decide whether or not to turn your cameras on during the talk, but especially during the Q&A sessions. Well, we'd like all the students in the seminar, but anyone else as well to turn your cameras on. And we'll invite you to do that. To avoid distraction, we will ask you to hold your questions until our speakers are done. We'll have quite a bit of time for discussion, and we'll use chat for that discussion, and we'll say more about that before that begins. And I'll just say that Neville Hode and Nina Ebner will be moderating the Q&A, and they'll tell you how that's going to go. So now, with no further ado, by way of formal introduction, Jennifer Bair is professor and chair of the Department of Sociology at the University of Virginia. And we were really looking forward to seeing her here in person and spending time to have engaged dialogue with her. But I'm going to try not to say that for every one of these meetings, because there are advantages to the virtual meeting, including that some of you are here who otherwise wouldn't be able to make it. Jen Bair's research interests are at the intersection of global political economy, work, and development. And she's written extensively, as I already suggested, about global value chains, and with that, a lot about world systems theory. Among her many writings, she's co-editor of Putting Labor in Its Place, Labor Process Analysis and Global Value Chains, and is also editor of Frontiers of Commodity Chain Research. And along with that, she's authored quite a few influential articles that, as I've mentioned, have had a big impact on our work. In addition to a collaborative book project on supply chain labor organizing that she's working on now, she's also studying efforts to ensure human rights protections for migrant workers in US agriculture. The paper she'll be presenting, I'm proud to say, is a key chapter in a book that Neville Hode and I are co-editing, And actually she has 2 chapters in that book. But this is the first one, which opens the section entitled Challenges to the Dominant Framings of the Future of Work. So that should give it some context. James Galbraith is Lloyd M. Benson Jr. Chair in Government Business Relations, and also Professor of Government, well, at the LBJ School of Public Affairs here at UT Austin. And he directs the University of Texas Inequality Project, is on the steering committee of the Rappaport Center, and was quite involved in the pop-up that I mentioned. There are many reasons he's an ideal respondent for Jennifer Bair's paper. To give you some, he's managing editor of Structural Change and Economic Dynamics, and he's authored or co-edited 6 books and 2 textbooks, probably more than that, I think, but including Inequality, What Everyone Needs to Know, which is as true now as it was 5 years ago when it came out, and The End of Normal, The Great Crisis and the Future of Growth. He also writes frequently for policy magazines and the general press, and is a terrific reader, as you will hear. So after they speak, as I said, Neville and Nina will moderate the discussion. But for now, I turn it over to Jen Bair. Welcome, and thank you again for being here.
Great. Thanks so much, Karen, and thanks also to Neville and Nina, and also Professor Galbraith. It's really humbling to be here and to have such a esteemed discussant. My only regret is I couldn't be with you in person as opposed to virtually, but I'm still really excited about the opportunity to share this work in progress with you. And I should say to start off, that it's a bit daunting to try to say something new about the future of work because it's a topic on which there has been so much ink spilled already. And there's such a huge diversity of opinions about the possibilities and perils that the future is going to bring. I hesitate to make any generalizations about conversations regarding the future of work because they are so vast. But I do think that if I were to hazard a generalization, it would be that most discussions about the future of work center in one way or another on technology, and especially on advances in automation and artificial intelligence. Robots actually have loomed particularly large in our collective imagination about the future of work. Some are optimistic. One line of thought is that automation will replace activities that people don't want to or actually maybe shouldn't do. I mean, aside from being boring, lots of routine tasks can also cause problems like repetitive stress injuries. And since robots don't get carpal tunnel syndrome, it would be great to automate those jobs, especially the people displaced by automation could be retrained to do things like operate robotic arms. According to this view, then, the future workplace is one where robots and humans kind of work side by side, as you can see from this picture on the left. This is actually taken from a Bloomberg assistance in the workplace. The techno-pessimist view, though, sort of epitomized by the picture on the right, is that the labor displacing effects of automation are worrying, and they're worrying not just for individual workers, but also for national economies, because one of the sectors in which some analysts expect robotization to have a profound impact is labor-intensive manufacturing, particularly textile and apparel manufacturing, which developing countries have long used as a starter industry in the industrialization process. So emblematic of this view, Erin Benedov, in a recent essay on the future of work, notes that jobs in these labor-intensive manufacturing industries were some of the first to globalize in the 1960s. Much of this kind of work has relocated to China since the 1990s. However, even as Chinese wages rise and other countries become more competitive, advances in robotics may finally be overcoming long-standing in these sectors, but they could eliminate lots of jobs very quickly and block access to the global economy for further low-wage countries in Africa, for example. So what Benedov is pointing out here is that up until now, it's actually proven really difficult to mechanize soft goods production, especially apparel manufacturing. And because this industry remains so labor intensive, most clothing purchased in the global north is manufactured where labor costs are low. For developing countries, then, the industry has been a critically important source of employment. There are an estimated 15 million garment workers in China alone. But as Benioff notes, rising wages in China have encouraged a relocation or expansion of garment manufacturing to other countries. So the industry employs 12 million people in India, 4 million more so in Bangladesh. And one of the newest entrants into the ranks of global garment exporters is Ethiopia. And the scenario Benioff is entertaining here is one in which the automation of sewing by so-called sobots undercuts Ethiopia's comparative advantage in cheap labor. Now, I should mention here, and this is an aside, but I think it's an interesting and important one, that this is precisely what sobots, and that's a trademark term, by the way, that's what they were designed to do. In 2002, Congress passed the Barrie Amendment, which requires the US military to purchase domestically produced uniforms for its 3 million employees. But this kind of Buy American policy has been challenging for the military to implement because 97% of all clothing purchased in the US is imported, and that includes the vast majority of work apparel like uniforms. So in 2012, the military's Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, the folks that brought us the internet, awarded a $1.3 million grant to a startup called Software Automation, housed at Georgia Tech. And the grant was to develop robotic sewing machines that could produce garments with zero direct labor. Sobots are the result of that investment. Now, to be clear, they're a long way from being able to produce a complex garment like a military uniform. What they're currently being used to produce are t-shirts, which is like the simplest garment to make. And they still do so with human labor. It currently takes about one person to operate 4 sobots. But the worry being expressed, and I want to emphasize, it's not just like being expressed by commentators like Benioff in the pages of the New Left Review, but it's also being expressed like by institutions like the World Bank and the ILO, the International Labor Organization, is that eventually this technology will advance to the point that sobots will be able to produce more complex garments and that they'll be able to do so with little to no human labor. So if garment workers in Africa producing clothing for Zara, for example, are replaced by robots in Spain, Ethiopia may not be able to do what other countries have done, that is successfully use labor-intensive industries to upgrade into more complex forms of manufacturing. This would amount essentially to a kicking away of the industrialization ladder that other countries have climbed. Now, I start with this scenario of the developmental implications of automation, not because I want to discuss how likely sobots are to affect employment in the global garment sector, but rather because I want to emphasize here that when we are debating the future of work, we're talking not only about jobs and livelihoods and what kinds of workers where will be replaced by robots. We're also talking about development and the degree to which changes in the future of work may threaten the prospects of countries in the global south. Now, for decades, these countries have been encouraged by some of the same international institutions that are now worried about the advance of sobots to maximize the opportunities that economic globalization presents by linking into global value chains. Global value chains simply refers to the sequential steps involved in the production of a good or service, from research and design and product development through to manufacturing, distribution, and marketing. In the contemporary global economy, most value chains for even a simple manufactured good, like a t-shirt, stretch across multiple countries and involve multiple firms, thus the term global value chains. The most labor-intensive links in the chain, in the case of the apparel industry, that would be sewing, is typically done in a country with low-cost labor. The thinking has been that by linking into global value chains, poorer countries can leverage their comparative advantage in low-cost labor to generate employment and to generate export revenues, but also to develop physical and human capital needed to sort of move up over time. And this process of moving up, or upgrading, as it's sometimes referred to along the value chain, is illustrated here by the well-known SMILE curve, which plots value added against sequential stages in the production process. That's the SMILE curve on the left. At the two ends of the SMILE curve are intangible activities. These include things like research and development, also design, branding, and marketing. In the middle of the chain are the tangible activities that involve actual physical production, the transformation of raw materials into components or the assembly of those components into final products. Now, of course, the particular activities carried out at each link in the chain are going to vary by product, but the general shape of the smell curve will actually look quite similar for products as diverse as iPhones, blue jeans, or a bag of pre-washed and trimmed green beans that you might buy at the supermarket. It's also true that for most value chains, there's a correlation between where the link is located along the smell curve and where the corresponding activities are carried out. The links at the bottom of the smell curve are the ones where most developing countries are accessing the value chain. Now, as you can see, in terms of value added, right, returns participation are relatively low at these links. These are at the bottom of the distribution of value added. But the employment impacts are really substantial, as you can see from the inverted smell curve on the right, which graphs the value chain with employment share instead of value added on the y-axis. Okay, but beyond the employment effects in the present, as important as those are, incorporation into global value chains is supposed to put developing country firms on potentially dynamic learning curves that they can use to move up to higher value-added activities over time, either in the same chain, moving, for example, from apparel manufacturing to garment design or logistics management, or eventually to completely different chains in other industries or even sectors, moving from, say, apparel manufacturing to the production of electronics. So upgrading via value chain participation is the sort of model of development that I want to argue widely, if sometimes implicitly, is shared by those concerned about automation in labor-intensive industries. And those concerns are reflecting a sense that the future of work might develop in such a way as to negatively impact the prospects of poor countries. The point that I want to make here is that speculating about the future of work in this way is a comparative exercise. It invites us to consider how technological developments might intervene in the path that we're on. So in this sense, predicting the future of work demands a narrative of work's present, of where we are and where we're headed or where we would be going in the absence of whatever changes that something like expanded automation, might bring. So in the rest of this talk, what I want to do is sort of focus on that present trajectory and offer one account of where we are and where we're going in the world of work. And specifically, just to foreshadow, I want to make two arguments. First, I want to explain why I think there's already reason to be skeptical of the upgrading via development. In particular, I'll explain how the value chain, how this kind of smile curve is deepening in ways that make it more difficult for developing country producers to ascend the learning curves that these chains are supposed to represent. This deepening of the smile curve is also connected to a shift in the distribution of income between capital and labor, as I'll discuss. Second, I want to emphasize financialization as a key underlying dynamic that is shaping our current trajectory. And I want to discuss in particular how it's implicated in the phenomenon of what economist David Weil calls the fissured workplace. Okay, so let's talk about the smile curve. To make an obvious point, global value chains do not arise spontaneously. These are concrete links between particular actors, and they're forged by a particular set of actors, typically, but not always, multinational corporations. And the actors that play the pivotal role in creating and managing value chains are referred to as lead firms. So if we go back to our example of the hypothetical Ethiopian apparel producer threatened by Spanish Sobats, the lead firm that I suggested would be Inditex, the company behind the brand Zara. Lead firms sit atop sort of a vast and globally dispersed supply base. For the producers comprising the supply base, securing the orders of those lead firms is the route to accessing or remaining in the value chain. So therefore, the route to accessing or remaining in global markets. Now, lead firms use their bargaining power over suppliers, including the vast realm of potential suppliers, to reduce the costs of the goods and services that they're purchasing. They do this by inducing competition among suppliers. And as Cedric Durand and Will Milberg have observed, this induced competition among suppliers is also a kind of competition among labor. And they know that the decline in the wage share in numerous countries, something I'll come back to, that accompanied the expansion of global value chain trade after 1995 is consistent with the weakening position of labor. So in this way, then, the proliferation of global value chains weakens the bargaining power of suppliers, as well as the bargaining power of the workers that they employ. A particularly stark example of this is shown here. This is from a recent analysis by Mark Anner, updating one that Mark and I did earlier, published in 2013, looking at trade data of trouser imports into the US by value and by volume. So this is cotton trousers. We're basically talking here about jeans and khakis. On the left, you see the evolution of unit values for the 5 leading exporters to the US up through 2017. These unit values come from the trade data, specifically from the import data. And what they are is basically like a proxy measure of the price that lead firms are paying their suppliers. And you can see from the graph on the left that there's some volatility in unit prices, both among the different countries and over the time period here. But when you compare the two graphs, you can see that the two countries whose unit values either stayed the same or declined, right? China and Bangladesh, that's the green and red lines here, are also the ones that have seen the largest increase in exports to the US. You also see that, with the exception of Mexico, the prices among the 4 leading exporters have converged over this time period, suggesting increased price benchmarking by lead firms. Most lead firms source from several of these countries. So if lead firms are paying less for the, sorry, I have a blind dog and he's trying to exit my office. So hold on one second. Go ahead, buddy. Go ahead. All right. I got them super tasty dog bones just for this occasion, but they seem not to have done the trick. Sorry about that. All right. So with the exception of Mexico, you can see that the prices among the 4 leading exporters have converged over the period, which suggests sort of increased international price benchmarking by the lead firms. And most lead firms source from at least 2, maybe all of these countries. Okay, so if lead firms are paying less for the jeans that they import from China and Bangladesh, where then is that savings going? Some of it, of course, is passed on to consumers in the form of lower prices at retail, but much of the differential between the lead firm's cost and the consumer's price is being appropriated by the lead firm. So using global value chains then to procure the goods and services that are sold in their stores or under their labels has really been an effective strategy for lead firms to boost profits. Drawing from research attempting to quantify the extent of the corporate profitability boost associated with globalization, the World Bank concludes that the average global markup increased by 46% between 1980 and 2016, with the largest increases accruing to the largest firms in Europe and North America and across a broad range of economic sectors. Now, that same World Bank publication, the 2020 World Development Report, is explicit in linking 3 things: market concentration among the lead firms, what some are referring to as kind of the oligopolization of lead firms, the bargaining power that they exercise over the suppliers, because of course there are many, many more suppliers than there are lead firms, so it's a very asymmetrical bargaining relationship. And then the distribution of returns between capital and labor. The share of income accruing to workers, or how much of the country's GDP accrues to labor through wages as opposed to physical capital and profits, is the other side of the markup phenomenon. Profits are rising, but labor share of income is falling. So here the bank is referencing the fact that over the past 30 years, there's been a downward trend in the labor share of income. Now, this trend's been widely noted in North America and Europe, where it's particularly pronounced. But there's some evidence of a similar decline in the global South. There's more heterogeneity among these countries, so the trend is less clear, as you can see from the graph, but there's some indication of a downward trend there as well. So the implication here is that the decline in labor's income share is connected, at least in part, to the ability of lead firms to squeeze suppliers by reducing value added along the bottom of the smile curve, principally through a reduction in labor costs. But dropping the bottom is really only one route to a deeper smile curve. Another way to get there is to increase the height of the sides by increasing returns to the intangible activities at the ends of the chain. These are the activities, again, like design, product development, and marketing, and they generate more value added than tangible production. That's not simply because they're sites of innovation. The rents accruing to these activities are also often, critically, an artifact of law. Activity connected to immaterial assets like brands. And once these brands are protected by intellectual property rights, like trademarks and copyright, they generate monopoly rents for their owners. Intellectual property rights then, from a value chain perspective, are barriers to entry that make the sides of the smile curve steeper and thereby make it harder for other firms to upgrade or move up into these links in the chain. Now, the proliferation of global value chains in the 1990s and 2000s has coincided with the strengthening of intellectual property rights, often via the negotiation and ratification of preferential trade agreements, which is what this graph is showing, sort of the explosion in these agreements with IPR provisions since the 90s. These agreements generally include stronger protections than those provided under the World Trade Organization's trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights regime, the so-called TRIPS. These parallel trends, the expansion of global value chains and the strengthening of intellectual property rights, have been complementary. Lead firms, after all, may be reluctant to externalize and outsource production to international suppliers in the absence of such protections, so they lobby for them to be strengthened. Stronger protections, once codified then in new trade agreements, further contributes to the expansion of global value chains. Okay, so we've talked about two ways then that the smile curve is deepening. One way is by lowering the bottom via downward cost pressure on suppliers, and the other is by lifting the sides via increasing return to the owners of immaterial assets. I've also noted that the deepening of the smile curve is affecting the distribution of income between capital and labor. The last point I want to make on this is that a deepening smile curve may mean that global value chains are already, in the present, not functioning as motors of mobility that the upgrading as development model suggests. What global value chains do appear to be doing is driving an increase in the profitability of many lead firms. Okay, so as I turn now to the last portion of the talk, I want to try to shed some light then on the question of where these profits are going, because I think that for understanding the future of work, this may be even more important than where they're coming from. Many companies appear to be funneling the gains from global value chains into financial assets rather than into fixed investment. And that dynamic may be depressing productivity growth and employment generation, while also, of course, rewarding the ownership class. Céline Beau and Cédric Duron, for example, illustrate this via an analysis of global retailers based in the US and Europe that expanded their use of international outsourcing in the 1990s. They find that these firms made aggressive use of global value chains to increase their profits and then invested those profits in financial assets. Lots of share buybacks. They also, of course, distributed value to their shareholders. Will Mulberg and Deborah Winkler diagnosed the same distributional dynamics, which they refer to as the offshoring financialization linkage. Namely, they find that most of the gains from globalization are being used to invest in financial rather than productive assets. So global value chains then are both fueling and reflecting the broader process of financialization, which sociologist Greta Krippner defines as a pattern of accumulation in which profits accrue primarily through financial rather than through trade and commodity production, which accrue primarily through financial channels rather than through trade and commodity production. Okay, so Krippner is defining financialization here at a macro level as a kind of shift in the primary locus of accumulation from industrial or commodity production to financial channels. And I just want to clarify that this is different from the idea that the financial sector, sometimes referred to as the FIRE sector for finance, insurance, and real estate. Some people, when they talk about financialization, are referring to the idea that that sector has become more important in terms of overall economic activity. Now, that's true. But even in the US, the FIRE sector accounts for less than a quarter. It's about 20% of GDP today. That's up from 10% in the immediate post-World War II period. But I want to draw that distinction because for the future of work, we should, I think, be conceiving financialization not as a specific sector of the economy, but rather as a logic that extends across all sectors and in really concrete ways affects how and where work is performed. Corporate governance is one concrete mechanism connecting financialization as a macro phenomenon to changes in where work is done and how it's organized. And I'm referring here, of course, to the shift from stakeholder to shareholder value. The doctrine of shareholder value holds that the ultimate measure of a company's success is basically the value that it delivers to equity owners of the corporation. That is basically the extent to which it enriches its shareholders. Now, this doctrine increases the pressure on corporations to focus on core competencies, defined somewhat circuitously as those activities that generate returns to investors. And typically, these are the intangible activities found at the ends of the smile curve, where the lead firm has invested in immaterial assets. But over time, as the definition of core competencies becomes ever narrower, the set of activities, or to put it in value chain terms, the number of links in the smile curve, the ones that are performed in-house shrinks, and the remainder that are being externalized to independent firms grows. The result is what David Weil calls the fissured workplace. In his book, he outlines the different forms that the fissured workplace can take. Outsourcing is the most obvious, but also franchising. This photo, of course, is a reference to the Fight for 15 campaign targeting McDonald's and other franchises, but also temporary work, agency work. These are all examples for Weil of fissuring. Now, I want to connect fissuring back to my earlier discussion of the deepening smile curve and this idea that lead firms are able to induce competition among suppliers to drop the bottom. Fissuring is one way in which the supply base has been created. At root, fissuring is really a form of market creation. It generates a market of service providers that compete for the business of client firms. We can think, for example, of the garment manufacturers in Bangladesh, China, and Mexico that we saw in an earlier slide. They're all competing for the orders of retailers. But we can also think of the packing houses that want to supply supermarkets with pre-washed and trimmed green beans. Or we can think about the janitorial service providers that are bidding for a cleaning contract with a local tech company. Compared to the client firm, the lead firm, these service providers, rather sewing factories or agricultural growers or cleaning contractors, we can consider all of them service providers. They're all competing in more competitive markets than the lead firm because they're separated from the locus of value creation. The prices that the client firm is going to pay, and thus the wages that the supplier's employees are going to receive, will reflect this greater intensity of competition in the market for outsourced services. Drawing the firm's boundaries around core competencies narrows the type of work and thus the type of worker that remains inside the organization. When janitors and security workers, for example, are employed by a large tech firm that also hires software engineers and programmers, their wages and benefits are likely to be higher than their counterparts employed by cleaning companies or security contractors. In extreme cases, fissuring can actually move an individual worker from inside to outside the firm, in which case she may find that as an employee of a subcontractor, she receives lower pay and fewer benefits for the same work she did when employed directly by the client firm. And that's because by externalizing work that was maybe previously performed in-house, the client firm has transformed a wage setting problem for itself into a pricing problem for its suppliers. Now, if fissuring is a form of market creation, then the scope of the market that it creates can and does vary over time and across industries. In some cases, the market may be really spatially limited, either because the externalized activities or services that have to be performed on site, like the cleaning or the security services or cable installation, or because the market involves physical resources or infrastructure that's fixed in place. We can think about things like coal deposits or cell towers. But for lots of other activities, there's actually basically no geographical restrictions on the scope of the market. And these are the industries in which global value chains have been particularly extensive. The market in this case is effectively global, and we can find examples in all sectors. For example, agricultural producers in Florida or Mexico that are looking to supply fresh tomatoes to fast food restaurants, manufacturers of wire harnesses in Vietnam or Indonesia or Bulgaria looking to supply auto assemblers, software developers in India, Pakistan, or Russia, all offering their services via digital labor platforms like Upwork. In his masterful book, The Fissured Workplace, David Weil's focus is really on domestic value chains and the consequences of fissuring for workers in the United States. He argues that fissuring is creating downward pressure on wages and conditions, but also, importantly, confusion about who's responsible for labor problems and violations when they do occur. Fissuring has sort of blunted the efficacy of traditional labor regulation and increased precarity for many US workers. And while changes in the world of work are particularly stark in the US, a similar transformation has occurred in many OECD countries. And those changes are reflected in growing rates of short-term and temporary work, the erosion of internal labor markets, and a decline in the collective power of workers vis-a-vis employers. Now, from the vantage point of the global north, this transformation is sometimes referred to as the decline of the standard employment relationship. Such a relationship is supposed to be standard, both because it represents a regulatory model, but also because that model is expected to be the norm, with in turn, like non-standard forms of work being atypical. The International Labor Organization defined standard employment as work performed in the framework of a full-time, formal, and open-ended, in other words, non-time-bound arrangement in a subordinate employment relationship. Temporary or part-time work, like fixed-term or zero-hour contracts, fall into this definition, as does temporary agency work or other forms of labor contracting. Outside of that definition of standard employment, as does temporary agency work or other forms of labor contracting in which the worker doesn't have a direct subordinate relationship with the end user of that labor. So in a few regions, such as the European Union, a majority of jobs continue to meet this definition, even if they account for a declining share of total jobs. But from a global perspective, what is really striking is how atypical the standard employment relationship is. There are a few estimates of the prevalence of standard employment globally, but the ILO did recently provide an estimate of total informal employment, a category which is inclusive of but not coterminous with non-standard employment. It estimates that 2 billion people aged 15 and over are engaged in informal employment. That number represents about 61.2% of the world's employed population. Now, of course, it's really important to note here that levels of social protection vary dramatically across countries and across regions of the world. So what it means to be working in the formal or informal sector, or what it means to be in a standard versus non-standard employment relationship also differs tremendously. But what the available data suggest is that non-standard employment, already high, in much of the world outside the OECD, is also increasing within it. Without conflating, again, the meaning or experience of informal work in these different parts of the world, I think it's nevertheless possible to identify a kind of convergence of the global north towards the global south, in the sense that more people in developed countries are today experiencing forms of work that diverge from the increasingly elusive standard of full-time, formal, and open-ended employment. So to close, what I've tried to do in this talk then is, in a sense, like work backwards from a discussion about the future of work to a history of the present. I've suggested that some of the anxiety about automation may be displaced or misplaced, not because jobs aren't likely to be lost if there are enormous advances in automation. But because I think such concerns, again, even if only implicitly, overstate the degree to which today's poorer countries are already, like before the armies of Sobots arrive, likely to replicate the trajectory followed by previous generations of late developers. And to unpack why this might be the case, I explained how the smile curve is deepening, rising at the ends through the valorization of immaterial assets, and lowering in the middle because of competition among a global supply base and the labor arbitrage that this competition encourages. I just want to close by reiterating that when we discuss the future of work, I really think that we need to start with a diagnostic of the present. And my claim here is that the logic of financialization and the corollary process of fissuring, they're already at work making work's future. So perhaps in the Q&A, we can imagine what interventions in that future might look like. But before that, I'm very excited to hear Professor Galbraith's thoughts and reactions and to take your questions. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Bair. So you just made the great segue to Professor Galbraith. So take it away, Jamie.
Okay, the floor is mine. I will proceed. Thank you. And it's a real pleasure to be here this evening and to have a chance to participate in this discussion. This is a very far-reaching and it's also a very challenging paper. I must say I had to read it several times to try and make sure I had at least some appreciation of the thread. It begins with automation and it moves along to the global value chain and ends up with fissuring and financialization, which is a process that is said to produce, and I'll quote here, dynamics of accumulation and distribution with an increasingly tenuous relationship to the production of goods and services. So if I could perhaps rephrase or paraphrase that point in a way which might possibly meet the approval of the author, I would do so in the following terms. The financial sector is predatory, destabilizing, dangerous, and prone to bouts of reckless and criminally fraudulent behavior, disconnected from and destructive to the ordinary economic activities of honest people. If that is at least partially compatible with Professor Bair's concluding point, then we are in full agreement. But let me backtrack and go back to the beginning and make just a few observations, and I won't pretend to be able to cover everything, as it would take me as much time as it took Professor Bair to make her argument in order to do that. But there's some points where we do have some difference of views, and it's worth perhaps saying something about that. The first concerns automation, or more recently, and I think more precisely, the word might be digitization. So it's the role of the electronic control mechanism in the work process, of which robots are just one aspect, essentially, of a much larger process. And the prospect that people will end up either unemployed or underemployed, or possibly at the knackers, like the horses who were displaced by cars and tractors in the teens and 20s of the last century. But so far, at least until the pandemic upended things a year ago, there's not a whole lot of reason to think that this has actually occurred. And I must say, I've worried about it as much as anybody, but if you look at least at the experience in this country, what happened was something else. And there was a lot of new job creation, but it was focused on services in the non-traded sector. The services were scaled to all the levels of income that among those who were demanding services, boutique services, services for a mass market population, and so forth. The issue that faced people who were, found their work basically confined to the sector was not so much employment as precarity. It was the fact that the jobs were unstable, They were, in many cases, in the memorable phrase of the late great David Graeber, they were bullshit jobs, and with mediocre pay, which therefore forced households, obliged households, basically to self-insure against the instability and the precarity that they were facing by reconstituting themselves amongst multiple earners. So the model that existed prior to the 1970s, essentially, of a single earner household supporting a middle or lower middle class living standard, is replaced by a multiple earner household with a very similar living standard, but earned at the price of many, many more hours of much more precarious employment. Overall, labor force participation went up, not down, I think, through 2000. Since then, it has declined in the wake of financial crises. So I go back to the point about financialization. But some of that is aging of the workforce. And most recently, of course, the pandemic, and we'll see what happens if there is an aftermath to the pandemic. The fact is, the rising share of non-traded services in employment reduces the effect and the importance of whatever may be happening in the global value chains, because ultimately, when there are no more production jobs left, the losses from offshoring from that point forward will be zero. There will be nothing left to lose, and the fraction of jobs that are subject to this kind of competition is not necessarily increasing, at least in the advanced countries. So that's, I guess, 2 points. A third point relates to this issue of the declining labor share. And again, my comment is restricted to the experience of the United States, but there may be parallel phenomena in other countries. Although I have a general warning against taking any information that's published in The Economist and using it. That's my niece used to write for them, and her summary of their basic credo was simplify, simplify, repeat, repeat. Anyway, but I draw on a paper I happen to have around. It dates back to 2013. Was published by the Brookings Institution. And the three authors, I make, I think, 3 points that are pertinent. In the US case, about 1/3 of the decline in the measured labor share of income is just a statistical artifact. It relates to the way capital income is imputed to those who are self-employed. And what happened in essence was that the estimates for a particular period, I think 81 to 91, was that there was a negative capital share, which is implausible. You change that assumption, the labor share from that period is therefore lower, and the decline is down about 1/3 to compared to what it shows up in the headline measure. Of the remaining 2/3 of the decline, most of that is due or is closely associated with the offshoring of low-wage production jobs. So not to a decline in the relative position of the workers who remain in the US economy, but rather to jobs that were apparently they were replaced by production jobs in Mexico and ultimately in China and elsewhere. And the third point is that within the labor share, so that the labor share, whether it was declining as much or not declining, is not necessarily the thing that's most interesting or relevant, because within the wage share, there's been a very large increase in the inequality of what is paid to people who are listed as making wages and salaries. And that's notably due to the rise of the financial sector, the technology sector, which pay very high wages compared to what might be called the stagnant services sector, which pays a mediocre wage that's essentially some premium above the minimum wage. Maybe twice the minimum wage, but still not nothing to write home about in terms of income. So the sectors, of course, that are very well paid are those very closely associated with financial capital. Finance itself, technology, which is largely an artifact of the financial sector, that they pour money into it and then they pay out from their venture capital and their borrowings. They don't pay out from revenues, which in many cases they don't actually have. That's sort of a sector which is basically a carnival of bets on a future that may or may not occur. But in any event, what this tells us is that the accounts that we use to separate capital and labor, these very traditional and somewhat archaic terms, are not particularly relevant to what is actually happening in the relationship between capital asset markets and ordinary, what we consider ordinary labor. So we really do need to think about our category structures and what terms we use and how we relate them to the accounting systems that are presently in use. Anyway, to boil all of this down and just without taking too much more time, I'll pass directly to broadly a question of what, given that we agree with the nature of the problem, and I think the points about fissuring and the general increase in the deliberate pressure on firms to increase the precarity and the instability of work in order to try and make financial targets, which is essentially what financialization is all about. What do you do? So I would say the following. The first is let's focus on those services jobs. That's where most of the jobs are. That's where most of the work is. And that's where most of the problem is. That's where most of the bad pay and instability of employment is. The first thing to do there is raise wages, and in particular, the minimum wage. And I've long been an advocate of that, a supporter of the fight for 15, and generally rebasing the minimum around something that was a decent, modest living standard would have a transformative effect on the structure of these markets, not necessarily reducing employment, but certainly changing the character of employment in an important way, and essentially putting down a labor standard that would greatly reduce the instability that many people face. And then secondly, because these jobs are necessarily they're not long-term industrial jobs that are supported by capital investment that's intended to pay out over 20 or 30 years necessarily. You have to reduce the precarity facing this population in a more comprehensive social way. And the social security system is there. That's what it's supposed to do. It can be strengthened and expanded. The old problem of health insurance is still with us. And the closer we can get to a universal healthcare system, the less instability and uncertainty people face as they go through a work life. Taking not only healthcare, but also higher education off of households' balance sheets in a way which frees them from the obligation of incurring large amounts of debt is a next step. It was always part of the New Deal arrangement that certain things should be done without separating out the private household sector from having to depend on the financial sector to finance its basically acquisition of education or the basic elements of security. That should be very high on the agenda. Providing alternatives to the private financial sector through public banking. Do these things unless you take some measures to bring the people who are responsible for this state of affairs under control. I would decapitate or anyway defund the oligarchs and particularly obstruct the creation of dynasties by vastly strengthening the estate and gift tax, essentially. And I would deconcentrate, decentralize, re-regulate the financial sector. And that's just so that the ordinary, honest people who I referred to earlier in this comment can just get on there with their lives and go about their business without having to be constantly calculating what the financial people are trying to do with them. So anyway, that's what I have to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Do I respond, Karen, or should we?
Yeah. Why don't
I
you take
would-
a few minutes?
Okay.
And then Neville's in charge after this.
Okay.
And Nina.
So I want to try to respond to everything a couple points that I just want to kind of pick up on is I think this point about there's been a lot of discussion about the pandemic. Well, first, actually, the economic crisis, but then the pandemic kind of signaling a sort of like terminal decline in global value chains. And there's obviously tremendous supply chain shortages right now that have underscored some of the sort of weaknesses, you know, in those systems. It's true that if you look at the data, so the way that you know, global value chains are a tricky thing to measure, but basically the way that the OECD and the WTO try to track trade and value added, their data suggests that sort of the extent of global value chains, that the percent of total trade that they consider to be global value chain trade peaked at around sort of 2008. So really the 1990s and sort of the you know, kind of the first decade of the 2000s was in some sense perhaps kind of the high watermark of global value chains. And there's been a discussion about, you know, what's the cause of the slowdown, to what degree is it just a kind of reflection of slowing growth. However, and so from the vantage point of the US, one way to read that is that, you know, the hemorrhaging of jobs, in some sense, the decline in kind of the relatively well-paid US manufacturing jobs, the loss of which, as you point out, have been so important in explaining a significant percentage of the distribution between labor and capital in the US, that's kind of reached its limit. And that if anything, we might begin to see a kind of reshoring happening, right? That one of the things automation does, of course, is make it feasible to produce, you know, labor intensive stuff that is now capital intensive back in higher wage economies. What's interesting though, from a global value chain perspective, is when we think about that trend, you know, it seems to me that a lot of what we're calling reshoring is actually something like nearshoring. So global value chains might be contracting, but they're not necessarily going away. So you might have the regionalization of value chains such that, you know, you're not going to necessarily have reshoring from China back to the US, but you might have regional reshoring from, say, China to Mexico. So for me, the question of sort of where these, you know, kind of where this production is moving and where it's going is interesting. And even as those chains then begin to maybe contract in some way, you know, there's still, you know, that production is still shifting. Once it's out of the US, then from the vantage point of maybe US employment, then, you know, those jobs are lost and unlikely return. But for me, what's also important is, you know, where do they go and where do they end up, and the kind of the cycles through which they're moving. So much of the production, much of the low wage manufacturing that it originally maybe went to Mexico and China, that is now kind of several generations past those relatively, right, sort of higher wage developing countries. It's moved to places like Cambodia or Bangladesh, or in the case of apparel, Ethiopia, as that example suggested. So yeah, so I think there is some suggestion that the pace of global value chain expansion is declining, and that's really interesting. But they continue to be a significant, you know, portion of global commodity trade. Okay, on the question of, I take all of the comments on the rather sort of the overly general use of the declining returns to labor measures, and I'll have to do a sort of a better job of that. I think the increase in the self-employed population is also potentially interesting to think about in terms of the changing organization of work. And the increase in the percentage of folks who are now considered maybe individual contractors versus employees. So that itself could be a manifestation or an artifact of fissuring. But what I really want to say that I think where we do agree is that I'm not at all certain that automation is going to have the kind of enormous impacts that folks are describing. There's already been quite a bit of research suggesting that some of the really kind of headline getting findings originally predicting that, you know, 40% of all jobs or 60% of all jobs would not exist, that those might have been overstated. And that in fact, I tend to agree much more, I think both with you, Professor Galbraith, and also in fact with Aaron Bedanov, whose essay in the New Left Review I cited, I kind of, to be fair, sort of cherry picked a quote from there where he's talking about concerns about the future of automation and its implications for poor countries. But the larger point that he makes in that essay is actually that, automation is not likely to change the real story, which is a kind of chronic increase in precarity and the problem of underemployment, particularly, not exclusively, but largely in developing countries. So that is kind of the big story, and that what happens in terms of automation on the margins is something that's kind of happening on the margins. I think when it comes to digitization, one of the things that I'd like to think more about and haven't really had enough time to think through is digital labor platforms, which I do think are operating in a somewhat different way vis-a-vis some of these dynamics than things like automation or robotization. There's some really great work coming out now on digital labor platforms. The ILO had a really excellent analysis last year of what's happening on that front. So yes, I mean, digitization is a sort of massive way to think about the changes in the world of work. Automation somehow seems a little more tractable in terms of getting your head around, but clearly sort of digitization is the larger and more important trend. Okay, finally, just really quickly, I don't disagree at all with any of the policy suggestions here. I do, again, though, worry about sort of where the resources to do all these things would come from in a world in which global value chains arguably, are being used, in fact, to connect up with what some analysts are calling global wealth chains, and to actually sort of extract value out of potentially economies through all kinds of basically sort of shenanigans with regard to taxation. So there's conversations obviously happening around things like BEPS as a way to figure out how to get some kind of traction on the massive tax evasion that essentially these kind of global wealth chains, I mean, one can basically map global value chains of the financial sector, which some are calling global wealth chains, and how they actually work also to kind of shift value and extract essentially wealth in ways that escape the capacities of tax authorities. So again, I think there is a kind of potentially a kind of global value chain or global angle to the argument, that we would need to figure out how to get some leverage on that in order to do these excellent things, which would essentially amount to, kind of a redistribution of wealth. I would say that where I want to end is just on the two things. I want to just say something about supply chain labor agreements. Karen mentioned that I'm working on that. I won't say much about that because it might come up in the Q&A. But I think one strategy that has emerged, it's really difficult to do globally, is essentially to say, okay, we do live in a world in which, fissuring has happened. We do live in a world in which, many workers essentially are experiencing terms and conditions of work that aren't really set by the direct employer, but that are actually related to the pricing structure in these value chains, which could certainly be domestic as well as global. So what workers need to do is actually try to reach up to the top of the chain and somehow negotiate essentially with the lead firms that are, ultimately employing them as something we might think of as kind of almost indirect employers. This has happened in a couple of different contexts. The Fair Food Program in the US involving the coalition of Immokalee workers is probably the best known example. But there is another program in Vermont that is trying to do this in dairy. The Bangladesh Accord, which involved garment workers and mostly European retailers, was sort of an approximation of the same idea. So that would be another way to essentially try to use global value chains almost as an opportunity structure for labor. And then finally, on the point that you made about, regulating the finance sector, I agree. I do think, though, that the concern about market structure is broader than just the finance sector, and this concern about kind of oligopolization and concentration among the lead firms reaches across, I would say, finance into certainly tech, but also potentially other sectors as well. So I think, competition regulation could be wielded a little bit more forcefully across a number of different sectors beyond finance itself. I'll stop there.
Wow, thank you both very much. That is a hell of a lot to think about, and a very provocative and great beginning to the colloquium.